The sun was shining brightly over the city, its golden light reflecting off the tall glass windows of the skyscrapers. Inside one of those glittering towers was a famous restaurant, known for its luxury, exclusivity, and the important deals that often unfolded within its walls. Expensive cars lined up outside as drivers opened doors for their wealthy bosses, while the doormen greeted each guest with a polite smile. It was the kind of place where power dressed itself in suits, polished shoes, and gold watches. Among the arrivals that afternoon was Mr. Grant, a millionaire CEO whose company had grown into an empire. He walked into the restaurant with the confidence of someone used to being in control. His suit was perfectly tailored, his tie knotted sharply, and his leather shoes tapped firmly against the marble floor. His face carried the air of someone who believed he was always the most important person in the room. Today was not just another lunch for him, it was a moment he had been preparing for months. Across the city, businessmen and investors were watching closely. A $200 million deal was about to be finalized. The restaurant, with its quiet elegance and private dining spaces, had been chosen as the perfect backdrop for such a high-stakes meeting. The hostess guided Mr. Grant to his reserved table by the large window. From there, he could see the city stretching out endlessly, the streets buzzing with cars and people who looked tiny from this height. He liked that view. It made him feel even more powerful, as though he were sitting above the world itself. As he settled into his chair, a waitress approached. She was young, dressed neatly in her uniform, her hair pulled back to keep her face clear. She carried herself with calm professionalism, though her eyes showed the tiredness of someone who had been working long hours. Still, her smile was polite, and her voice soft but clear as she greeted him. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome. Would you like some water while you wait for your guests?" she asked kindly. Mr. Grant barely glanced at her. To him, she was just another worker, someone whose presence hardly mattered in the grand scheme of his life. He waved his hand dismissively. "Yes, yes, sparkling, make it quick." The waitress nodded without offense, turning away to bring his order. For her, it was a normal interaction. She had served hundreds of customers, each with their own moods and personalities. Some were kind, some were rude, and some, like this man, were simply impatient. She had learned to keep her composure no matter what. As she left, Mr. Grant leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the table. He checked his watch, a gold piece worth more than some people's yearly salary. Time was money to him, and he hated waiting. He thought about the investors he was meeting, picturing how impressed they would be when they signed the deal. $200 million meant expansion, prestige, and another headline about his brilliance in the business world. Around him, the restaurant hummed softly. Gentle piano music filled the background, mixing with the low voices of other diners. Waiters moved gracefully between tables, balancing trays of expensive dishes. The smell of roasted meats, fresh bread, and fine wine lingered in the air. Every detail of the place spoke of luxury, from the crystal glasses to the polished silver cutlery. The waitress returned with his sparkling water, setting it down carefully in front of him. "Here you go, sir. Would you like to see the menu while you wait?" she asked. Again, he didn't look at her directly. He was already scanning his phone, replying to emails with quick, sharp movements. "Just bring me the filet mignon," he said curtly, "medium rare, and make sure it's not overcooked. Last time I came here, the chef ruined it." The waitress nodded. "Of course, sir. I'll make sure it's prepared exactly as you like." She walked away quietly, her posture still straight, her steps measured. She had dealt with people like him before, people who believed the world revolved around them. For her, this was simply part of the job. For him, it was a stage where he expected everyone to play their role perfectly. Minutes passed, and the investors began to arrive one by one. They greeted Mr. Grant with firm handshakes and polite smiles. Some were older, with gray hair and cautious eyes. Others were younger, sharp and eager. They all carried the same anticipation, knowing this deal could change the future of their companies. The waitress returned several times to the table, refilling glasses, noting orders, and making sure everything was in place. Each time, she was polite, professional, and careful, and each time, Mr. Grant barely acknowledged her. He was too focused on impressing his business guests, laughing loudly at his own jokes, and speaking with the confidence of someone who thought nothing could ever go wrong. But life has its own way of humbling people. What seemed like an ordinary lunch was quietly turning into the stage for something much bigger. A single word, a careless insult, would soon change the course of the afternoon. What Mr. Grant didn't know was that one of his guests was already watching closely, not just his business strategies, but his behavior, his character, and the way he treated those around him. The deal, worth $200 million, wasn't just about contracts and numbers. It was also about trust, values, and integrity. And before the plates were even served, the seeds of his downfall were being planted, unnoticed by him, but very clear to everyone else who was paying attention. The restaurant was busy that afternoon. Polished shoes tapped against the marble floor. Waiters glided gracefully between tables, and the quiet hum of conversations filled the air. For most guests, this was a place of leisure and luxury, but for the staff, it was another long day of hard work. Among the staff was Alina, the young waitress assigned to Mr. Grant's table. She had been working double shifts for weeks, saving every penny she could. Life had not been easy for her. Her mother was ill, her younger brother was still in school, and most of the household responsibilities rested on her shoulders. Despite all this, she never let her personal struggles show while she was at work. Customers only saw her polite smile, her calm presence, and her steady hands carrying trays of delicate glasses and expensive meals. Alina believed in doing her job with dignity. Whether the customer was kind or arrogant, whether they tipped generously or not at all, she treated them the same, with respect. She had learned long ago that her work was not just about serving food, but about carrying herself with grace in an environment where not everyone saw her as equal. When she first approached Mr. Grant's table, she had noticed his sharp tone, his dismissive wave of the hand, and the way his eyes barely met hers. It wasn't new to her. Many wealthy customers behaved that way, as though waitstaff were invisible until something went wrong. Still, Alina kept her voice steady, her smile in place, and her service professional. As she returned to the kitchen, she reminded herself, "He is just another customer. Stay calm. Do your job well." She placed his order carefully with the chef, emphasizing the details he had demanded. "Filet mignon, medium rare, not overcooked," she repeated firmly, making sure there would be no mistakes. The chef nodded, and Alina moved on to serve other tables. She carried trays of steaming pasta, refilled glasses of red wine, and answered questions about the day's specials. Even when her feet ached and her back begged for rest, she remained attentive. Every table mattered. Every customer deserved the same focus. Meanwhile, Mr. Grant grew louder at his table. Alina could hear his voice booming across the dining hall as he bragged about his empire, his wealth, and the huge deal he was about to close. She didn't react. She had learned to tune out such conversations, though sometimes they stung. Hearing people talk about millions of dollars while she struggled to cover her mother's medicine bills. But Alina carried herself with pride. She knew the value of her work, even if others did not. When she returned to his table to refill the glasses, one of the investors smiled kindly at her and said, "Thank you." The simple acknowledgement warmed her heart. Not everyone looked down on her role. Some people understood that kindness cost nothing. But Mr. Grant remained focused on himself, hardly noticing her presence as he scrolled through his phone between conversations. Still, Alina didn't take it personally. She knew patience was part of her strength. Many of her co-workers often said she had a special way of calming tense situations, of keeping her composure when others might snap. It was why her manager often trusted her with the most difficult tables. Back in the kitchen, one of the junior waiters whispered, "Isn't that the CEO at table 7? The one from the news?" Alina nodded, balancing a tray of desserts for another table. Yes, that's him. Must be nerve-wracking serving someone like that, the young waiter said. Alina shook her head softly. At the end of the day, he's just another customer. Rich or not, everyone deserves good service. Her words were simple, but they carried the truth of her character. She didn't measure people by their bank accounts. She measured them by how they treated others. By the time the meal was being prepared for Mr. Grant's table, Alina had already served half a dozen others. Her hair stuck slightly to her forehead from the heat of the kitchen, but she didn't complain. She wiped her hands, straightened her apron, and prepared to return to his table. What she didn't realize was that her dedication had already caught someone's attention. One of the investors sitting with Mr. Grant had been quietly observing her since the beginning. He had noticed how she smiled politely despite being dismissed. He had seen how carefully she handled each request, how patient she remained even when the CEO barked his orders. To him, these were small but telling signs. They showed more about character than any flashy speech about success. When Alina returned with the appetizers, she placed each dish neatly, making sure everyone at the table had what they needed. Mr. Grant didn't bother to thank her, but one of the investors nodded and gave her a small smile again. Alina acknowledged it with a polite nod before stepping back. She moved on quickly to another table, helping an elderly couple who needed extra assistance. She pulled out chairs, adjusted the silverware, and even bent down to listen carefully when the old man spoke softly about his dietary restrictions. To her, every detail mattered. As the afternoon went on, Alina's energy began to fade, but she pushed through with quiet strength. She thought about her mother waiting at home, her younger brother depending on her, and her dream of one day studying further if life allowed it. Each tray she carried was another step toward that dream, another brick in the foundation she was building for her family. At Mr. Grant's table, laughter erupted as the CEO told a loud joke about one of his competitors. His guests chuckled politely, though some looked uncomfortable. Alina passed by silently, carrying a tray of drinks, her posture graceful and her steps steady. She didn't realize that her quiet strength was already standing in stark contrast to his arrogance. For Alina, this was just another shift, another long day of work. She had no idea that her patience and dedication, qualities she lived by every day, would soon play a part in changing the course of a $200 million deal. The restaurant had settled into its rhythm of soft clinking glasses, murmured conversations, and the faint notes of piano music drifting from the corner. For most diners, it was a pleasant afternoon. For Mr. Grant, however, patience was running thin. He had been speaking loudly, his booming voice filling the private section where his guests sat, and his laughter often seemed more for himself than for anyone else. His investors tried to keep the conversation light, nodding and chuckling at his jokes, though some glanced at one another with faint unease. They had expected confidence, of course. He was a millionaire CEO after all, but arrogance this thick was harder to ignore. Alina approached with a tray, balancing the carefully prepared appetizers. She set them down gently, one by one, making sure each plate was placed neatly. Her hands were steady, though her legs were tired from hours of constant movement. She leaned forward slightly to adjust one of the napkins that had slipped, and in that moment, Mr. Grant snapped his fingers impatiently. "Where's my steak?" he demanded, his tone sharp. "I asked for filet mignon nearly 20 minutes ago. Do you think I have all day to wait?" Alina straightened quickly. "I'm sorry, sir. The chef is preparing it carefully, just as you requested. It should be ready shortly." Mr. Grant let out an exaggerated sigh, rolling his eyes at his guests as if to invite them to share in his irritation. "See what I deal with? Even in expensive places like this, service is slow and careless, truly ridiculous." The words were loud enough for Alina to hear, though she kept her expression calm. She offered a polite nod and quietly stepped back, determined not to let his rudeness break her composure. One of the investors cleared his throat softly. "I'm sure the kitchen just wants to make sure everything is perfect," he said diplomatically. "Try a quat." to ease the tension. But Mr. Grant smirked. Perfect? It's a steak, not rocket science. If they can't handle something this simple, what does that say about the rest of their service? The laughter he expected from his guests didn't come. Instead, there was an awkward silence, broken only by the clinking of cutlery as one of the investors shifted his plate slightly. When Alina returned moments later with refilled glasses, she placed one gently near his hand. "Here you are, sir," she said softly. Mr. Grant didn't even look up. He waved his hand dismissively, knocking the edge of the glass so that it wobbled dangerously before she steadied it with quick reflexes. A small gasp came from a nearby table who had seen it, but Alina just nodded again, quietly swallowing the sting of his behavior. His arrogance only grew as the meal continued. He interrupted his guests constantly, speaking over them whenever they tried to share their thoughts. He bragged about his fortune, about the cars he owned, about the luxury holidays he took. Every sentence seemed designed to show off his wealth and power. At one point, one of the investors tried gently to shift the conversation toward the deal they had come to discuss. "Mr. Grant, perhaps we could review the terms of the contract while we wait for the main course." But the CEO leaned back in his chair, smirking. "What's the rush? You'll sign it anyway. Everyone wants to work with me. There's no better option out there." The arrogance in his words hung in the air like heavy smoke. Some of his guests exchanged quick glances, uneasy but unwilling to challenge him directly. Alina returned again with a basket of bread, setting it in the center of the table. She moved quietly, carefully, doing her best not to disturb the tense atmosphere. But as she reached to place a small dish of butter, Mr. Grant looked at her sharply, his patis, and snapping once more. "Are you deaf?" he barked. "I asked about my steak 10 minutes ago. Do I have to repeat myself 100 times before something gets done here?" The sudden harshness in his voice startled nearby diners who turned to look. The entire hall seemed to pause, waiting to see what would happen. Alina lowered her eyes slightly, steadying her breathing before she replied. "I understand, sir. I'll check with the kitchen immediately. Please excuse the delay." Her voice was calm, respectful, and steady, even though his words had cut deeply. But Mr. Grant wasn't finished. He gave a short, cruel laugh, shaking his head. Then, in front of everyone at his table, he muttered the word that would change everything. "Foolish. Absolutely foolish." The word hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Some of the investors stiffened. A few diners at nearby tables whispered in shock. Alina froze for the briefest second, her heart pounding, before she straightened again. She didn't reply. She simply nodded, turned quietly, and walked toward the kitchen, her dignity intact. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. One of the investors leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Mr. Grant. Another pressed his lips together, clearly unimpressed. Mr. Grant, however, seemed oblivious. He poured himself more water, chuckled, and went back to boasting about his wealth. To him, calling a waitress foolish was nothing more than a throwaway insult. But to the people watching, especially the investor who valued character as much as profit, it was a window into the CEO's true nature. What Mr. Grant didn't realize was that his arrogance had just planted the seed of his downfall. The very deal he thought was guaranteed was already slipping from his grasp, not because of numbers or contracts, but because of one word and the way he had spoken it. The restaurant was no longer just a place for food and conversation. It had become a stage, and every person in the room was watching. The moment the word foolish left Mr. Grant's lips, a ripple of discomfort spread across the dining hall. Some customers looked away awkwardly, while others shook their heads in quiet disapproval. But one man, seated just a few feet away at another table, was watching more closely than anyone else. This man was Mr. Carter, one of the key investors in the $200 million deal. He had chosen a seat slightly apart from Mr. Grant's main table, so he could observe quietly before joining in the formal discussions. It was his style. He believed that a person's behavior outside of the boardroom often revealed more than any polished business pitch ever could. As he sipped his wine, Mr. Carter's sharp eyes followed the scene. He had noticed the waitress from the very beginning. He had seen her smile politely, even when Mr. Grant ignored her. He had seen her steady hands saving the glass from tipping when the CEO nearly knocked it over. And he had seen the way she remained calm and respectful, even when insulted in front of an audience. Mr. Carter respected that kind of composure. To him, character mattered as much as numbers. He believed that anyone could make money, but not everyone could make a difference. And now, as he listened to Mr. Grant belittle someone who was simply doing her job, a warning bell rang in his mind. He leaned back in his chair, observing closely. The arrogance dripping from the CEO's words was impossible to ignore. This wasn't the confidence of a capable leader. It was the carelessness of someone who thought he was untouchable. The other investors at Mr. Grant's table shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsettled by the scene. But they forced polite smiles, too cautious to speak up. Mr. Carter, however, wasn't one to ignore what he saw. He knew that the way a leader treated people beneath them revealed the truth of who they really were. As Alina walked away, her head held high despite the insult, Mr. Carter felt a deep respect for her. He could see the quiet strength in her posture, the dignity in her silence. She hadn't retaliated, hadn't snapped back, though she had every right to. Instead, she carried herself with grace, leaving Mr. Grant's insult to echo back at him like a mirror of his own arrogance. Mr. Carter's thoughts turned to the deal at hand. $200 million was not a small amount. It would tie his company's future closely with Mr. Grant's empire. But what would it mean to partner with a man who lacked basic respect for others? Could he trust someone who dismissed people so easily? Someone whose pride seemed bigger than his vision? He swirled the wine in his glass slowly, his mind weighing more than numbers now. He remembered his own journey, how he had started small, working his way up, respecting every worker who had helped him along the path. His father's words echoed in his mind. Respect is the currency that never loses its value. Across the room, Alina reappeared with another tray, still moving gracefully despite the sting of humiliation. She set down plates at another table, smiling politely at the guests who thanked her. Mr. Carter's gaze followed her, admiring her resilience. She had been insulted publicly, yet she chose professionalism over pride. That, to him, was true strength. Mr. Grant, on the other hand, seemed completely unaware of the impression he had made. He leaned forward, laughing at his own jokes, speaking louder than necessary, and boasting about his business achievements. His arrogance filled the air like a bad perfume, and the more he spoke, the more Mr. Carter's doubts grew. Finally, one of the other investors at the main table tried to smooth things over. "Well, let's focus on the positives," he said awkwardly, raising his glass. "To future success." But Mr. Carter didn't raise his glass. He remained quiet, his sharp eyes still on Mr. Grant, weighing every word and action. He was no longer just evaluating the numbers behind the deal. He was evaluating the man himself. In his mind, a decision was already beginning to form. A $200 million partnership wasn't just about profits. It was about trust, about aligning with people who reflected the values of his own company. If a man could insult a hardworking waitress without a second thought, what would stop him from betraying a partner when things got difficult? As the main courses were finally brought out, Alina returned with Mr. Grant's steak, perfectly cooked as requested. She set it down carefully, her hand steady. "Here is your filet mignon, sir. Medium rare, as you asked," she said softly. Mr. Grant barely looked at her. He cut into the meat quickly, tasted a piece, and then smirked. "Well, it's about time," he muttered, his tone dripping with disdain. Mr. Carter's jaw tightened. That single moment confirmed everything he needed to know. The waitress had done her job flawlessly, yet the CEO still found a way to belittle her. It wasn't about service. It was about power. He set down his glass slowly, his decision now clear. This deal would not go through, not while this man was at the center of it. Money meant nothing if it was tied to arrogance and disrespect. As Mr. T continued boasting, completely unaware of the storm building beside him, Mr. Carter leaned slightly back in his chair. His mind was already moving to the next steps. A phone call would be made. Papers would remain unsigned. The $200 million deal that Mr. Grant thought was guaranteed was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't even know it. The true turning point of the afternoon had arrived, not in the contracts or the presentations, but in a single careless word spoken to a waitress. And Mr. Carter, the quiet witness at the next table, would make sure that word carried consequences far greater than Mr. Grant could imagine. Alina stood near the kitchen doors, tray balanced against her side, trying to steady her breathing. The words still echoed in her ears. Foolish. She had heard insults before. Working in high-end restaurants, she knew some customers came in carrying their egos like shields, ready to strike anyone who dared not bow low enough. But for some reason, this moment lingered heavier than usual. It wasn't just the insult itself. It was the way Mr. Grant had said it, loud, careless, as if her dignity had no weight at all. She could still see the smirk on his face, the dismissive wave of his hand, the way he had turned back to his investors as though she were nothing more than a disposable shadow in the room. For a moment, her chest tightened with anger. A part of her wanted to march back to his table, place the tray down firmly, and tell him exactly what she thought of his arrogance. Another part wanted to run into the kitchen and let the tears fall. But Alina had lived too long with hardship to let either impulse control her. She closed her eyes, took a slow breath, and whispered to herself, "Hold your head high." Her mother had always told her that strength wasn't about shouting the loudest. It was about standing tall when others tried to push you down. And so, Alina chose silence. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of self-respect. When she stepped back into the dining hall, her posture was straight, her movements calm. If anyone expected to see her shaken, they were mistaken. She carried herself with quiet grace, her eyes soft but steady, her hands moving with the same precision as before. She served glasses of wine at another table, her smile polite, her voice warm. Guests noticed. The couple she had helped earlier with dietary needs gave her a reassuring smile, as if to say they had witnessed everything. She returned the smile gently, though she didn't linger. There was still work to be done, and she refused to let one man's words define her. At Mr. Grant's table, the atmosphere was different. The investors sat stiffly, their expressions tight. They were polite enough to laugh at his jokes, but their laughter no longer reached their eyes. Alina sensed the tension, though she didn't let it affect the way she served them. She refilled their glasses, cleared plates, and replaced silverware with the same calm precision. Every time she returned, Mr. Grant seemed to grow louder, as though trying to reclaim the room. He continued to boast about his wealth, his cars, his vacations. His words spilled over like champagne, but they lacked substance. To Alina, he looked less powerful and more desperate, though she would never say it aloud. In contrast, her silence spoke volumes. Every movement, every careful placement of a dish, every soft "excuse me" carried with it a dignity he could never touch. Where he tried to command respect through arrogance, she earned it naturally, without force, without noise, just by being herself. One of the investors caught her eye when she placed a plate before him. His look was subtle, but full of meaning. It was as if he wanted to say, "You've shown more strength in silence than he has in all his words." Alina gave him a polite nod before stepping away. In the kitchen, one of her co-workers whispered, "How do you do it? If someone called me that in front of everyone, I'd lose it." Alina simply shook her head. "Losing it won't change who he is, but keeping my calm shows who I am." Her co-worker blinked, impressed. "You're stronger than you look." Alina smiled faintly, but inside, her heart ached. Strength was heavy sometimes. It meant swallowing the pain, carrying it quietly so others wouldn't see. But she knew one truth. No insult could strip her of her worth unless she allowed it. As she returned to the floor again, she noticed something she hadn't before. People were watching her, not with pity, but with admiration. The quiet witness at the next table, Mr. Carter, had his eyes fixed on her. His expression wasn't just curiosity, it was respect. Alina didn't know who he was. To her, he was just another diner in a sharp suit, another guest to serve. But to him, she had already shown more leadership in her quiet endurance than the millionaire CEO had in his loud arrogance. At one point, Alina passed Mr. Grant's table again, her tray balanced with empty dishes. He barely glanced at her, muttering another complaint about the timing of the meal. But Alina didn't flinch, she didn't respond. Instead, she focused on her steps, her balance, the rhythm of her work. She knew her dignity was her shield, and she refused to let him pierce it. The contrast grew sharper as the minutes ticked by. Mr. Grant, with all his wealth and power, looked smaller with each boast, each insult, each arrogant remark. Alina, with her simple uniform and quiet smile, stood taller with every act of composure. By the time dessert orders were being taken, the energy in the restaurant had shifted completely. Mr. Grant still believed he was in control, but everyone else could see the truth. The waitress he had called foolish was the strongest person in the room. Her strength wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, steady, and unshakable, the kind of strength that leaves an imprint long after the moment has passed. And though Alina didn't know it yet, her quiet endurance was doing more than keeping her dignity intact. It was changing the course of a $200 million deal, one small act of grace at a time. The air in the restaurant grew heavier as the meal went on. What had started as a luxurious lunch was now laced with discomfort, like a fine fabric snagged and torn by arrogance. Mr. Grant still laughed loudly, still raised his voice over others, but the sound no longer filled the room with confidence. Instead, it echoed awkwardly, as though even the walls rejected it. The investors tried to stay polite, but the cracks were showing. Some tapped their fingers against their glasses, some stared down at their plates longer than necessary. They were here to finalize a $200 million deal, yet the discussion that should have been filled with clarity and focus was drowning in the noise of one man's pride. Mr. Carter, seated nearby, had watched enough. He had come into the meeting open-minded, ready to examine numbers, projections, and strategy. But what he had witnessed instead revealed more about leadership than any contract ever could. Every boast, every careless insult, every dismissive wave of Mr. Grant's hand carved deeper doubts into Mr. Carter's mind. He wasn't looking at a visionary leader, he was looking at a man who mistook arrogance for strength. And to Mr. Carter, that was dangerous. The true moment of turning came subtly, without warning. Alina returned to the table to offer dessert menus. Her steps were light, her face calm, though inside she still carried the sting of earlier words. She held the menus carefully, distributing them one by one. Most of the investors thanked her softly, their tones gentler than before, as if they wanted to compensate for what they had witnessed. But Mr. Grant, unable to let a moment pass without making himself the center, snorted and said, "Dessert? I don't need dessert. What I need is better service next time." The room went silent again. Even the pianist in the corner seemed to pause mid-note. Alina gave a quiet nod, refusing to let her dignity crack. "Of course, sir," she said softly before stepping away. Her silence was powerful, but it was Mr. Grant's words that had sealed his fate. Mr. Carter leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table, his sharp eyes fixed on the CEO. "You know," he said calmly, his voice steady but carrying weight, "how someone treats the people serving them says a lot about their character." The investors shifted, surprised. Mr. Grant looked at him with raised eyebrows, clearly not expecting to be challenged. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his tone half dismissive, half defensive. Mr. Carter didn't flinch. "It means respect is earned, not demanded. And when I see someone unable to respect those working around them, it makes me wonder how they'll treat their partners in business." A heavy silence followed. The other investors avoided eye contact, but their expressions betrayed agreement. They had all felt the same unease, but hadn't dared say it aloud. Mr. Grant gave a forced laugh, waving a hand. "Come on, you're really going to judge me on how I talk to a waitress? This is business, not charity." But Mr. Carter's gaze didn't waver. Business is built on people. If you can't respect people, you can't build trust, and without trust, there's no deal worth signing. The words hit harder than any insult could. Mr. Grant leaned back in his chair, his face reddening, but he tried to laugh it off again. "You're exaggerating. You all know I deliver results. That's what matters." But the investors' faces told a different story. Some exchanged glances, others shifted uncomfortably. The room had tipped. What once felt like a guaranteed deal now hung on a fragile thread, and everyone knew it. Alina, standing at a distance, felt the shift too. She hadn't heard every word, but she could sense the tension in the air, the way silence pressed down heavier than before. She carried another tray past the table, her movements calm and deliberate, though her heart beat faster. Something important was unfolding, and she was caught in the middle without even realizing it. Mr. Carter picked up his glass and set it down again slowly, as though punctuating his thoughts. "Money can buy a lot of things, Mr. Grant," he said firmly, "but it cannot buy respect, and it certainly cannot buy integrity." Those words were the turning point. The atmosphere shifted completely. No longer was this just about contracts or figures. It was about values, about the kind of leader they wanted to entrust with $200 million. The investors at the table said little, but their silence was loud. They weren't defending Mr. Grant anymore. They weren't laughing at his jokes. Their eyes were cast downward, their minds already reconsidering everything they had come here to finalize. Mr. Grant, however, seemed blind to it all. He puffed out his chest, gave a dismissive wave, and muttered, "Integrity doesn't pay the bills, results do." But in that single careless line, he proved Mr. Carter's point. The turning point was complete. The deal that had once seemed unshakable was now hanging by a thread, unraveling not because of financials or strategy, but because of a single man's arrogance. And at the center of it all was the waitress he had dismissed as foolish, whose quiet strength had exposed more truth than any business meeting ever could. The restaurant's atmosphere had shifted completely. What had begun as a polished lunch filled with clinking glasses and polite conversation had now turned into a silent battlefield. The food was on the table, but no one seemed hungry anymore. The investors' forks rested untouched, and their eyes were no longer on their plates. They were on Mr. Grant. He, however, was oblivious. He cut into his steak with exaggerated motions, chewing loudly as though to fill the silence he didn't understand. "Now," he said, mouth half full, "let's get down to the details of this deal. I've already outlined the terms. All you have to do is sign, and we'll make history together." But his words no longer carried the same weight. They floated in the air, hollow, unsupported by the respect he had expected to command. Mr. Carter, who had been patient until now, leaned back in his chair, his hands folded calmly in front of him. His expression was unreadable, but his silence spoke louder than words. The other investors glanced toward him, waiting for him to lead, to put into words what they were all thinking. Finally, one of them cleared his throat. "Mr. Grant, about the contract. There are a few concerns we'd like to revisit." Grant laughed dismissively, waving his hand as if brushing away dust. "Concerns? What concerns? The numbers are solid. My track record speaks for itself. You won't find a safer or more profitable investment than this." But no one nodded. No one smiled. The uneasy silence stretched again. Alina passed by at that moment, clearing empty plates from another table. Though she kept her eyes down, she felt the weight of the tension pressing in from across the room. Every word, every pause, seemed to carry the power to break or build fortunes. Mr. Carter finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Numbers aren't the issue here, Mr. Grant. The question is character." "And what?" I've seen today doesn't inspire confidence." Grant froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. He blinked at Carter, genuinely stunned that anyone would dare challenge him so directly. "Character," he repeated, scoffing. "Since when do we make business decisions based on how someone treats a waitress?" The word waitress was spat out like it carried no worth, but in that very moment, it carried more weight than all his boasts combined. Carter didn't flinch. "Since always," he said simply. "Because if you can't treat the people serving you with respect, why should we believe you'll treat your partners with fairness?" The table went silent again. This time, it wasn't awkward, it was decisive. The other investors exchanged glances, and the truth was clear in their eyes. The deal was collapsing, and it wasn't because of financial projections or profit margins. It was because of arrogance. Grant's face reddened. He slammed his fork down onto his plate, the sound sharp against the quiet. "This is ridiculous. You're all overreacting. Do you have any idea who I am? Do you know how many people would kill for this deal?" But his words, meant to intimidate, only exposed his desperation. His power was slipping, and he knew it. One of the quieter investors spoke up now, his voice soft but steady. "Respect is the foundation of trust, Mr. Grant. Without it, money means nothing. I'm not comfortable moving forward." Another investor nodded in agreement. "Neither am I." Grant turned his glare on Carter, as though expecting him to rally the group back in his favor. "And you? Are you really going to let a simple misunderstanding ruin the biggest deal of the year?" Carter's reply was measured, almost gentle, but it struck like a hammer. "It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a reflection of who you are. And I don't invest in arrogance. I invest in integrity." The words hung in the air like a verdict. The deal was dead. Everyone knew it, even if no one had said it outright. Grant sat frozen, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the table. For the first time that afternoon, his confidence cracked. He looked around at the faces of his investors, searching for support, for loyalty. But there was none. The power he thought he commanded had evaporated, leaving him exposed. Alina, walking past with a tray, caught a glimpse of his face, red, strained, and angry. She didn't know the full details of the business unraveling at his table, but she understood one thing clearly. The insult he had thrown at her had not gone unnoticed. In some quiet, unexpected way, dignity had triumphed over arrogance. The investors began to gather their papers. One by one, they stood, shaking hands with Carter, exchanging polite farewells with each other, but offering Grant only stiff nods. Not a single person said, "Congratulations." Not a single person smiled at him. Grant remained seated, his steak half-eaten, his glass of wine untouched. For a man who had entered the restaurant boasting about power and success, the silence around him now was louder than any applause could have been. The $200 million deal was gone. Slipped away not because of market conditions, not because of financial risk, but because of one man's inability to show respect. And though Alina had said nothing, though she had kept her silence and her composure, she had become the symbol of that truth. Her quiet strength had revealed his weakness, and in doing so, had changed everything. Grant finally pushed back his chair with a sharp scrape against the floor. He stood abrupt, his pride wounded, his voice shaking with fury. "You'll regret this," he snapped, glaring at Carter. "All of you will regret this." But the words carried no power anymore. They were empty threats, spoken by a man who had just watched his empire crack, not from an enemy's attack, but from his own arrogance. And in the corner of the room, unnoticed by most, Alina continued her work, calm, steady, and dignified. She had no idea she had been part of a story much larger than herself, but the investors knew. Carter knew. And even Grant, deep down, knew. The collapse of the deal was complete.